The drilling rig stood like a metal giant against the gray West Virginia sky, its hydraulic arms frozen mid-motion as if waiting for permission to tear into the earth. Sarah Mitchell planted her boots in the mud at the base of the access road, shoulders squared despite the tremor running through her legs. Behind her, 12 others formed a human chain across the gravel path, their breath visible in the November cold. Sheriff Thomas Reed stepped out of his cruiser, one hand resting on his belt, the other clutching a folded court document. His face carried the weight of a man forced to choose between the law he swore to uphold and the debts he could never repay. The black SUV rolled to a stop 30 feet away. David Klein emerged wearing a charcoal coat that probably cost more than Sarah had earned in the last 6 months. His shoes gleamed despite the mud. Everything about him suggested a man who had never been told no. He walked toward the blockade with measured steps, his smile thin and professional. "Ms. Mitchell, this is your last chance." Sarah's hands trembled, but her voice held steady. "I'm not moving." Jim Warren shifted beside her, his stance borrowed from decades-old military training, protective without being aggressive. His gray beard couldn't hide the set of his jaw. Behind them, barely visible in the gathering crowd, Emma Mitchell clutched her great-grandmother's locket, the tarnished brass warm against her palm. The sheriff's radio crackled. Somewhere in the distance, another engine rumbled to life. Sarah's breath caught as the moment stretched, suspended between what had been and what might never be. Then the world froze. Everything stopped. The question hung in the air like smoke. How did a homeless woman end up blocking a multi-million-dollar mining operation? The answer started 2 months earlier in a place where hope went to die. The bus station at 2 in the morning looked like every other bus station at 2 in the morning. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that made even the healthiest skin look jaundiced. Sarah sat on a plastic bench that had been designed by someone who had never intended for people to get comfortable. The cold seeped up through the seat, through her coat, through the layers she had wrapped around her daughter. Emma shivered against her side, small for 10 years old, made smaller by the oversized sweater that had been donated by a church in Pennsylvania, or maybe Ohio. Sarah had lost track of which state had given them which clothes. They all blurred together after 6 months of moving from shelter to shelter, church basement to community center. Each one a temporary sanctuary with rules and curfews and silent judgment. The security guard walked past for the third time that hour. His eyes were soft but tired, the eyes of a man who had seen this story play out 100 times before. He didn't tell them to leave. Instead, he paused for just a moment, a beat longer than necessary, as if his silence granted permission. Emma's sneakers rested on the floor between them, the soles worn so thin that Sarah could see the outline of her daughter's toes. They needed new shoes. They needed a lot of things. The list had grown so long that Sarah had stopped keeping track somewhere around item 37. The question came quietly, barely above a whisper. "Mom, how long can we stay here?" Sarah didn't answer right away. The truth sat heavy on her tongue. They could stay until the morning shift guard arrived, the one who followed the rules more carefully. They could stay until someone complained. They could stay until the cold or the hunger or the exhaustion finally broke them. Instead, she pulled Emma closer. "Until they tell us we can't." Emma leaned into her mother's warmth, accepting the non-answer because trust was the last thing they had left. That terrified Sarah more than the cold, more than the hunger, more than the uncertain morning ahead. Her daughter still believed things would get better. They had been moving for months. A church basement in Columbus where the heating barely worked. A women's shelter in Pittsburgh that smelled like industrial cleaner and desperation. A community center in Lexington that allowed 3 nights maximum before you had to prove you were looking for work. Each place had been a stepping stone across a river that kept getting wider. Now they sat in Charleston, West Virginia, with a vending machine that only accepted exact change and a phone battery that hovered at 8%. The bus schedule on the wall promised connections to places Sarah couldn't afford to reach. She looked at Emma's sneakers again. The soles had been fine in September. Now it was November, and winter in the mountains didn't wait for permission. That's when she noticed it. The envelope sat upright on the bench across from them, leaning against the metal armrest as if someone had placed it there deliberately. Not dropped, not forgotten, but positioned. Her name was printed on the front in block letters that looked official and old-fashioned at the same time. Sarah Mitchell. The words looked strange. Her name hadn't belonged to anything in so long that seeing it printed felt like reading about someone else. She reached across the gap between benches and picked it up. The paper was thick, the kind used for documents that mattered. An embossed seal pressed into the upper corner caught the fluorescent light. Mitchell Estate Legal Office, Clay County, West Virginia. Her hands froze. The last time she had seen the word Mitchell next to the word estate was never. Her family didn't have estates. They had disappointments and broken promises and mothers who drove away swearing they would never look back. Emma had stopped shivering. She was watching her mother's face instead, reading the shift in expression with the practiced attention of a child who had learned to gauge adult emotions for survival. The envelope tore open with more force than Sarah intended. The letter inside unfolded across her lap, crisp and formal and impossible. She skimmed the first paragraph. Then her breath caught, and she read it again, slower this time, making sure the words said what she thought they said. You are the sole heir to the Mitchell farmhouse and surrounding property, established 1882, Clay County, West Virginia. Her fingers trembled as she held the paper up to the light, looking for signs of a cruel joke. But the courthouse seal was real. The lawyer's signature was real. The address was real. That old house. That old land. Memories surfaced like bodies in a flood. A porch that creaked with its own language. Summers thick with heat and the buzz of insects that seemed to vibrate in her bones. Blackberry bushes that left scratches on her legs like small red signatures. Running barefoot through mud that squished between her toes. And the last memory, sharp enough to draw blood. Her mother slamming the car door, face twisted with something between anger and grief. We're never going back to that place. That place kills dreams. That place traps you. Sarah had believed her because that's what children do. They believe their parents, even when their parents are running from ghosts. Emma leaned over, trying to read the letter upside down. Does it mean we still have family? The question hit harder than it should have. Sarah inhaled sharply, pushing down the instinctive response. Family was complicated. Family was Catherine Mitchell, her grandmother, a woman she hadn't seen since she was 14. A woman she had thought didn't care enough to reach out, to bridge the gap her mother had created. But maybe caring looked different when you were protecting something bigger than feelings. Emma's finger traced the embossed seal with the kind of reverence reserved for things that might break. Does it mean we have a house? Sarah couldn't speak for a moment. A house. Not a shelter bed that you had to vacate by 8 in the morning. Not a church basement where you slept on a cot surrounded by strangers. Not a place where you apologized for existing. A house with a key, a door that could close without permission. 4 walls that belonged to no one else. The word barely made it past her throat. It might mean that. But something else stirred beneath the hope, something unfamiliar and heavy. Responsibility, the kind that settled in your chest and didn't leave. You could be sleeping in a shelter or under a sky full of stars, but when a letter finds you in a bus station at 2 in the morning, it changes the trajectory of everything that comes after. A bus hissed to a stop outside, its air brakes sighing like something exhausted. Snow began to fall in thin spirals, visible only when it passed through the pools of light from the street lamps. A woman with 3 overstuffed bags hurried past the window, hunched against the cold. Emma pulled her mother's coat tighter around both of them. What's Clay County like? Sarah stared at the map printed on the second page of the letter. The Appalachian ridges tangled across the paper like scars that had never healed properly. Rivers wound through valleys marked with names that sounded like prayers or warnings. Old mining towns, some crossed out entirely, others barely marked. She remembered a scent, wood smoke and wet earth, and something else. Something she hadn't let herself think about in years. Home. The word tasted strange in her mind. We're going to find out. Emma's eyes widened. You mean we're going? Sarah hesitated for only a second, not because she doubted the decision, but because speaking it aloud made it real. Yes, not because she trusted the house, not because she believed in inheritance or providence or any of the things that sounded good in stories, but because deep down, in a place she had stopped looking a long time ago, she felt the house might have been waiting. Not for someone worthy, but for someone who had finally run out of other options. She didn't sleep that night. She watched the windows until dawn, watched buses arrive and depart, watched strangers drift through the station like ghosts passing between worlds. But she didn't feel invisible anymore. The letter in her pocket had weight. It had her name on it. At sunrise, the mountains rose in the distance, colorless and silent and ancient. The kind of old that made human problems feel temporary. Sarah Mitchell, who had spent 6 months with nowhere to stay, now had somewhere to return to. Maybe not a welcome, but a return. She and Emma boarded the morning bus heading north. Emma pressed her face against the glass, watching the ridges grow larger as they drove deeper into coal country. The land rose around them, swallowing the road in shadow. The question came softly without warning. "Mom, do houses remember people?" Sarah didn't answer for a long time. Outside, the mountains stood silent, holding their secrets the way mountains always had. Finally, she spoke. "Some do." And somewhere between the valleys and the ridge lines, beyond the abandoned mine roads and forgotten towns, a house waited in the November cold. The gravel road curved like a question mark through bare trees, leading them higher into terrain that felt both familiar and foreign. The bus had dropped them in town 2 hours earlier. From there, everything required walking. Sarah carried 2 bags, one duffel slung across her back, the other gripped in her hand. Emma walked beside her, layered in sweaters that didn't quite fit, her boots crunching through ice that had formed overnight in the tire ruts. They hadn't spoken much since leaving the bus stop. Sarah focused on the weight of the bags, on putting one foot in front of the other, on not thinking about what they would find at the end of this road. Emma focused on not complaining about the cold, or the distance, or the uncertainty. The last time Sarah had walked this road, she was 14 and furious. She had stormed out of the house barefoot after another fight with her mother, swearing she would never come back. Catherine had watched from the porch, arms crossed, silent. She hadn't chased. That had hurt more than anything her mother had said. Emma broke the silence. "Is it far?" Sarah shook her head, though she wasn't entirely sure. Memory had a way of distorting distance. "A little more." They rounded the last bend, and there it was. The farmhouse rose out of the overgrown brush like something shipwrecked and left behind. 2 stories tall, barely holding together, the white clapboards peeling in long curls that exposed gray wood underneath. The porch sagged to one side as if the house had grown tired of standing in straight. One shutter hung at an angle, the hinges rusted through, but the chimney still stood. The roof hadn't collapsed, and the window above the front door reflected the overcast sky like an eye that never blinked. Emma stopped walking. "Is that it?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Sarah stared at the house, at the cornerstone barely visible beneath the moss. 1882. The numbers had faded, but they were still there. "Yeah, that's it." Emma stepped closer, her breath fogging. "It's kind of sad looking." Sarah's throat tightened. "It's been waiting a long time." The wind picked up, rattling the broken shutter. Somewhere in the trees behind the house, a crow called out and went silent. Emma's voice dropped to a whisper. "You think it remembers you?" Sarah looked at the front steps, at the porch boards worn smooth in the center from generations of footsteps. She remembered Catherine's voice, rough and certain. "The wood creaks different when it remembers your name." She climbed the steps slowly. Each board groaned beneath her boots, the sound both warning and welcome. She couldn't tell which. The brass key from the lawyer's envelope stuck in the lock. She jiggled it once, twice, feeling the mechanism resist like something that hadn't been asked to work in years. Then it gave with a hard click that echoed in the silence. The door swung inward. Cold air rushed out to meet them, thick with dust and old wood and something else. Smoke, maybe, or dried herbs, a scent that hadn't changed in decades. Emma wrinkled her nose. "It smells like old stories." Sarah stepped inside first. The floor groaned beneath her weight, announcing her arrival to empty rooms. The front room opened before them with high ceilings and faded wallpaper patterned with tiny red flowers. The floorboards were stained dark in patches, marked by time and feet and lives that had moved through this space. The furniture hadn't moved. An old couch sat against one wall, its fabric faded to a color that might have been blue once. A rocking chair waited by the fireplace. A mirror hung above the mantel, cracked diagonally like something had tried to escape through the glass. Dust covered everything in a soft gray layer that muted color and definition. It felt like stepping into a memory someone had folded up and stored in an attic. Emma wandered to the staircase and ran her hand along the banister. Wood grain caught at her palm. "This place is huge." Sarah nodded. The house was bigger than she remembered. The ceilings higher, the rooms deeper. Or maybe she had been smaller then. Children measured the world differently. They explored in careful silence. The kitchen was exactly as it had been in her memory, an enamel sink chipped in one corner. Up in shelves lined with mason jars, some still holding preserved vegetables that had gone dark with age. A rusted stove hunched in the corner like something alive but sleeping. Sarah flipped the light switch out of habit. Nothing happened. She hadn't expected anything. But something pulled at her attention. She walked to the pantry and found the fuse box mounted on the wall, gray metal dulled by time. She flipped the main breaker. A hum vibrated through the walls. Then she flipped the individual switches one by one. The kitchen light blinked to life. Emma gasped from the doorway, eyes wide. "We have light." Sarah gripped the edge of the counter for balance. Light. Something so simple it shouldn't have mattered. But it did. For 6 months, light had been a favor granted by someone else. A luxury rationed. A privilege earned by good behavior and quiet desperation. Here, it was just theirs. She forced her voice to stay level. "We'll have to get it officially turned on, but yeah, we've got wiring." Upstairs, they found the bedrooms. The small front room had been Sarah's once, back when summers stretched long enough to feel infinite. The iron bed frame remained, covered with a quilt that smelled like cedar and thyme. She sat on the edge, and the mattress gave beneath her weight with a soft exhale. For a moment, she was 12 again, lying in this bed listening to Catherine's voice drift up from downstairs. The memory felt close enough to touch. Emma bounced beside her, testing the springs. "Can I have this room?" Sarah smiled despite the exhaustion settling into her bones. "If you're okay with the ghosts of all my terrible teenage decisions." Emma grinned. "Deal." They spent the afternoon making the space livable, opening windows to air out decades of stillness, beating dust from cushions until their arms ached, stacking the few canned goods still in the pantry, checking dates, discarding anything that had swollen or rusted through. Sarah got the water running after 20 minutes of fighting with the old pump in the basement. When it finally coughed to life, the pipe shuddered and groaned like something waking from a long sleep. The sun began to dip behind the ridge as they worked. Shadows stretched across the floor, reaching like fingers trying to grasp something just out of reach. In the kitchen, they heated soup from a can on the single burner that still worked. No plates, just the warmth of bread torn and shared, breath visible in the cooling air. Emma spoke around a mouthful of soup. "Did Grandma Catherine live here her whole life?" Sarah stirred her portion, watching steam rise. "Almost. She left once for a few months when she was young. But she came back." Emma swallowed. "Why'd your mom hate it?" Sarah hesitated. The answer was complicated, layered with things she didn't fully understand even now. She thought this place kept her stuck. She wanted neon signs and city sidewalks, not mud and mountains. She broke off a piece of bread, the crust hard enough to require effort. But Grandma thought old things were worth fixing. Emma nodded like that made perfect sense. At 10 years old, the world was still simple enough to fit into categories of right and wrong. After they ate, Sarah wandered the house by lamplight. Her fingers brushed along door frames worn smooth by hands that had opened and closed these doors for over a century. She touched furniture that had witnessed births and deaths and everything in between. In the kitchen, one frame caught her eye. It hung on the wall beside the pantry door, but the photo was missing. Just a faded square on the wallpaper where something had once been displayed. The frame itself didn't look decorative, it looked deliberate. Built in, she stepped closer, studying the edges. Her finger found the corner and pressed. A soft click. The frame swung open on a hidden hinge. Behind it, a small recess had been carved into the wall. Inside lay a metal tin and a bundle of papers tied with string that had yellowed with age. Sarah stared. Her first thought was simple. Why hide something like this? Her second thought came darker. What were you afraid they'd find? She pulled the tin free. It was heavier than it looked, the metal cold against her palms. She didn't open it. Not yet. Behind her, Emma appeared from the hallway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Mom, what's that?" Sarah held it up, turning it in the lamplight. "I don't know yet." The fire in the stove crackled softly, the only sound in the house besides their breathing. Sarah looked at the frame, at the tin, at her daughter standing in the kitchen where generations of Mitchell women had stood before. The house didn't just remember. It was telling her something, and she was finally ready to listen. In the distance, wind swept across the mountain through bare trees, rushing through branches like a congregation releasing breath. Tomorrow they would open the tin. Tomorrow they would follow whatever trail Catherine had left behind, buried in walls and hidden in places only family would think to look. Tomorrow, the mountain would start to speak. The next morning brought a sky the color of wet concrete and cold that made the floorboards contract with sharp cracks. Sarah sat at the kitchen table with the metal tin between her hands. Emma sat beside her, wrapped in the quilt from upstairs, hair still messy from sleep. Neither of them had touched the tin since finding it. It had sat on the table all night like a third presence, silent and waiting. Sarah ran her thumb along the seam where the lid met the base. Her pulse drummed in her ears. She wasn't afraid of what was inside, not exactly. She was afraid of what it would change. "Ready?" Emma bowed down, nodded, eyes wide. Sarah pried the lid open. Inside were photographs with scalloped edges, black and white images that had faded to sepia. Faces looked up at her, frozen mid-expression. Men in suspenders standing beside wagons. Women in long skirts positioned in front of this very house. The porch straight and new behind them. Near the bottom, one photo was sharper than the rest. Catherine Mitchell in her 30s, standing next to a man Sarah didn't recognize. He wore a suit too polished for mountain life, his posture suggesting someone accustomed to authority. Catherine held a rolled document in one hand, her mouth set in a hard line. Sarah flipped it over. "The day they tried to buy us out," written in Catherine's tight script. A knot formed in Sarah's chest, pulling tight. She set the photos aside and lifted the bundle of papers tied with fraying twine. They were heavier than expected, more substantial. Old deeds and survey maps spilled across the table. Yellowed pages covered in faded handwriting and official stamps. Emma reached for one of the maps. "Is this our land?" Sarah nodded slowly, studying the hand-drawn lines. "Some of it, yeah." She unfolded the most intact survey. It had been drawn by hand, every detail carefully rendered. Topography lines curved like ribs across the page. A ridge, a creek, a narrow path, and then an X marked in red ink. Next to it, a note in feminine handwriting, "Springhouse Original." Sarah leaned closer, breath catching. This wasn't just a reference to a water source. This was something marked with intention, meant to be found by someone who knew how to look. She turned to the next document. It bore the seal of a mining company, the ink faded but still legible, dated 1952. The letter made an offer for what it called fair compensation for subsurface access rights to the Morgan property. Another page, this one in Catherine's sharper handwriting, contained only 3 lines. "Not enough. Not for what you want. Not for what this place has already given." Then a response from the company, the language clean and professional, but the message unmistakable. Progress would happen with or without her cooperation. Sarah sat back in the chair, the weight of decades settling on her shoulders. Emma pointed to the corner of one map. "That's our house, right? And that's the ridge we walked past yesterday?" Sarah nodded. "Yeah." Emma touched the X again, her finger tracing the red ink. "So what's there?" Sarah stared at the mark for a long time. The question sat between them, unanswered but heavy with possibility. "I think that's what she wanted us to find." Emma blinked. "Like treasure?" Sarah laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. "Ma treasure? Truth, maybe." She ran a hand over her face, feeling the exhaustion of the night settling into her bones. Then she gathered the maps into a neat stack and stood. "Put your boots on. We're going out." The cold hit them as soon as they opened the door. The wind had teeth today, biting through layers and finding skin. The trees beyond the clearing stood like sentinels, bare branches reaching toward the gray sky. Sarah held the map in one hand, Emma's fingers in the other. They crossed the backyard and ducked beneath the broken fence line. The terrain sloped gently downward before rising again toward the northern field. The trail, if it had ever been a trail, was long gone beneath grass and frost. But Sarah remembered pieces of it from childhood, where the stones shifted underfoot, where the cedar trees leaned slightly west as if listening to something beyond hearing. Halfway up the ridge, Emma stopped and looked around. It's quiet. Sarah squeezed her hand. Not quiet. Listening quiet. They reached the spot marked on the map. At first there was nothing but trees and rocks and the cold pressing in from all sides. Then Sarah spotted it, tucked between two old oaks, a crumbling structure half buried in leaves and shale. The spring house. What remained of it? The stones were weathered smooth, the wood roof caved in decades ago. But water still trickled nearby, steam rising where it emerged from between the rocks. Emma crouched beside the spring, extending one cautious finger. It's warm. Sarah touched it too. Not boiling, but noticeably mild despite the freezing air. Geothermal. The mountain heats it from below. That explained why families had built structures here. Warm springs during harsh winters meant survival, meant storing food when everything else froze. She looked up at the stone wall behind the spring. Something felt wrong, but in a way that suggested intention rather than decay. One slab of shale sat at an angle that didn't match the others. Sarah brushed away moss and snow. Her fingers found a carving, faint but deliberate, a circle split by a downward line, the same symbol scribbled on the map. She pressed her hand against the stone. It gave slightly, just enough to feel the movement. She pushed again, harder this time. The slab groaned. Then, with a shiver of dust and time, it slid inward and swung outward on a hinge that shouldn't exist. Cold air spilled from the opening, stale and undisturbed. Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs. Behind the stone was a passageway, narrow enough that a person would have to slide through sideways. The darkness beyond swallowed her flashlight beam for the first few feet before revealing rough stone walls. Emma looked up, voice barely a whisper. Is this where she hid something? Sarah didn't answer. She aimed the flashlight into the passage, following the beam until it terminated in what looked like a chamber carved into the rock itself. She stepped inside first, testing the floor with each careful step. When it held, she motioned for Emma to follow. The tunnel was short, maybe 20 feet, ending in a space large enough for 3 people to stand comfortably. A single wooden chest sat in the center, darkened by time but intact. No lock, just a simple latch, aged but functional. Sarah knelt and opened it. Inside were 3 bundles. The first held letters dated from the late 1800s, tied neatly with twine that crumbled at her touch. The second was a stack of detailed land surveys, more precise than anything she had seen in the tin at the house. Geological notes, mineral composition, water tables, names of mining veins marked and cross-referenced. The third bundle was wrapped in linen that had yellowed but held together. Sarah unwrapped it carefully, her hands moving with reverence she didn't quite understand. A metal canister, embossed with an insignia she recognized from history books. U.S. Geological Survey, 1896. Her breath caught. Inside was a rolled parchment marked confidential in faded red ink. She unrolled it slowly, her hands shaking now. The document detailed mineral reserves located beneath the Mitchell property. Rare earth elements in concentrations that would be worth millions today. Maybe tens of millions. The words blurred as she stared. Emma leaned over her shoulder. Is that real? Sarah nodded slowly, unable to speak. Emma's voice dropped. What does it mean? Sarah stared at the stone walls around them, at the damp earth, at the years that had passed in silence while this chamber held its secrets. The dead don't bury secrets. They hide them where the living forget to look. That's what this was. Not just a secret, a warning. And maybe a burden heavier than any inheritance of land or house. She gathered the documents carefully, placing them back in the chest. We're done here. They crawled back through the passage. Sarah pulled the stone slab shut behind them, listening to it settle into place with the weight of finality. As they made their way down the ridge, the world felt different, heavier. The trees leaned closer, the sky pressed down, the silence carried weight it hadn't before. Because now they knew something worth keeping, and somewhere, someone might already know they had found it. Tomorrow, Sarah would go into town. because if this land was worth something, she needed to know who else had been waiting for her to return. But tonight they would lock the doors and sit by the fire, and Sarah would try to understand what Catherine had really left behind. Not wealth, not opportunity, responsibility. The knock came just after dawn, 3 sharp raps that cut through the quiet of the farmhouse. Sarah had been awake for an hour already, studying the documents spread across the kitchen table by lamplight. Emma still slept upstairs, wrapped in quilts that smelled like cedar and decades. Jim Warren stood on the porch with a toolbox in one hand and fresh bread wrapped in cloth in the other. He was tall and weathered, 62 years etched into the lines around his eyes. His gray beard couldn't hide the military bearing that straightened his spine even at rest. Catherine asked me to look after the place. Didn't expect anyone to come back. Sarah studied him through the gap in the doorway, her hand still on the frame. How did you know I was here? His eyes softened in a way that suggested stories he wasn't ready to tell. I'm the one who left that envelope at the bus station. The words landed like stones dropped in still water. Sarah's grip on the doorframe tightened. You've been watching me? Jim shifted the toolbox to his other hand. Tracking, not watching. There's a difference. He gestured toward the bread. Violet Hayes sent this. She knew you'd be hungry. Can I come in? Sarah stepped aside, questions multiplying faster than she could organize them. Jim entered with the careful movements of someone accustomed to assessing spaces for threats. His eyes swept the kitchen, noting the documents on the table, the empty soup cans from last night, the way Sarah positioned herself between him and the stairs where Emma slept. He set the bread down gently. Catherine and I had an understanding. If anything happened to her, I'd make sure the right person knew what she'd protected. Sarah crossed her arms. And you decided I was that person? Jim's face carried the weight of decisions made in the dark. You came back. That's more than anyone else did. He pulled out a chair and sat without waiting for permission, the gesture of a man who had earned his right to be here through years of loyalty to someone now gone. I was a mining engineer, worked surveys in Kentucky and Virginia through the 70s and 80s, saw what happens when companies get what they want. His hands rested flat on the table, scarred and calloused. Catherine showed me what's buried under this land 20 years ago. Made me promise I'd help whoever inherited it understand what was at stake. Sarah remained standing, processing the implications. You know what's in the spring house? It wasn't a question. Jim nodded. And the South Hollow, and 3 other places she marked that you haven't found yet. Emma appeared at the bottom of the stairs, hair tangled from sleep, eyes cautious. Jim glanced at her and his expression shifted, the hard edges softening. You must be Emma. Your great-grandmother talked about you. Emma moved closer to her mother but didn't speak. Sarah's throat tightened. She knew about Emma? Jim's smile carried sadness. She knew everything. Small towns don't keep secrets well. When you ended up in that shelter in Pittsburgh, word made it back here within a week. The revelation stung more than Sarah wanted to admit. Catherine had known, had tracked her granddaughter's descent into homelessness, and had waited until death to offer help. Jim seemed to read her thoughts. She wanted to reach out, but your mother made her promise years ago to stay away. Catherine kept that promise until she couldn't anymore. He stood and moved toward the window, looking out at the ridge beyond. 3 days before she died, she gave me your last known location and told me to make sure you got the inheritance papers when the time was right, not before, after. Sarah's hands trembled. Why wait until she was gone? Jim turned back, his eyes holding truths he'd carried alone too long. Because living people can be pressured. Dead ones can't. The weight of that settled in the kitchen like smoke. Emma spoke for the first time, her voice small but steady. What's buried here? Jim looked at Sarah for permission. She gave a slight nod. Rare earth elements, minerals used in electronics, renewable energy, defense systems, worth tens of millions, maybe more, depending on extraction methods. Emma's eyes widened. So we're rich? Jim shook his head. You're responsible. There's a difference. He moved back to the table and pulled out a folded map from his jacket, older and more detailed than the one Sarah had found. Your great-great-grandfather surveyed this entire valley with nothing but a compass and steady hands. He found the mineral deposits in 1896, recorded everything. Then he buried the information and told his daughter to protect it. Sarah leaned over the map, tracing the hand-drawn lines. Why not sell it? Use it? Jim's finger tapped a notation in the corner. Because he understood what it would mean: the mountain torn apart, the water poisoned, the families displaced. He decided some things weren't meant to be sold. Sarah thought of the USGS documents in the spring house, the careful records hidden in stone. And Catherine agreed. Jim nodded. For 70 years, she turned down offers, each one bigger than the last, each refusal followed by pressure that got harder to resist. He pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a photograph. A black SUV parked at the edge of the property, partially hidden by trees. I took this yesterday morning. Same vehicle has been here 3 times in the last week. Sarah's stomach dropped. They know I'm here. Jim's jaw tightened. They've known since you arrived. Question is what they'll do about it. Emma moved closer to the table, studying the map with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Can't we just tell them no like great-grandma Catherine did? Jim's expression darkened. Times have changed. Companies are more sophisticated now. They use lawyers and zoning laws and political pressure instead of direct threats. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But when legal methods don't work, they still remember the old ways. Sarah felt the room tilt slightly. She grabbed the back of a chair for support. We need to talk to Violet. Jim nodded. I'll drive you. There are things she needs to tell you that I can't. The drive to Violet Hayes' house took 15 minutes down roads that narrowed with each turn. Jim drove with the precision of someone who had made this journey many times before. Sarah sat in the passenger seat while Emma pressed her face against the back window, watching the mountains slide past. Violet's house sat at the edge of town where pavement gave way to gravel and then to dirt. Wind chimes made from old spoons and bolts sang in the breeze. A wooden rooster watched from the windowsill with one painted eye. Violet opened the door before they knocked, as if she'd been waiting. Took you long enough. She was thin and hard, 78 years compressed into a frame that looked like it could survive anything. Her gray hair was tied back in a braid, her eyes sharp and assessing. Sarah started to introduce herself, but Violet cut her off. I know who you are. You look like Catherine did at your age. Come in before the cold eats through your coat. The inside smelled like lemon oil and wood smoke. Photographs covered every wall, a timeline of Catherine Mitchell's life rendered in black and white and faded color. Violet gestured toward the kitchen table. Sit, I'll make tea. Jim moved to help, but Violet waved him off. You've done your part. Let me do mine. They sat in silence while Violet prepared chamomile tea in a pot that had seen decades of use. When she finally joined them, she set down 4 cups and looked directly at Sarah. Catherine was my sister, not by blood but by choice. We fought like thunder and lightning, but we never stopped talking. She pushed a wooden box across the table. She left this with me, said to give it to you when you were ready to understand. Sarah opened it carefully. Inside was a locket, tarnished with age, and beneath it a stack of papers bound with a rubber band that had gone brittle. The locket opened with a soft click. One side held a photo of Catherine as a young woman, smiling in a way Sarah had never seen. The other side contained an inscription in tiny, precise letters. This land remembers who loved it. Sarah's throat closed. Violet tapped the papers. Those are copies of every offer Catherine received, every threat, every attempt to force her out. 70 years of pressure documented and filed. Sarah pulled the first letter free. It was dated 1952 from a company called Appalachian Mining Solutions. The language was professional, the offer modest by today's standards. $5,000 for mineral rights. Catherine's response was paper-clipped to the back, handwritten and brief. No. The second letter came in 1973. The offer had increased to $50,000. The language was less friendly, references to economic development and community benefit, woven through implied warnings about property taxes and maintenance costs. Catherine's response? No. 1998 brought an offer of $500,000 and a letter that barely bothered with pleasantries. The company had done their research. They knew what was buried. They wanted it. Resistance would be noted. Catherine's response remained unchanged. Violet sipped her tea, watching Sarah process the timeline. The last offer came 2 months before she died. 7 figures. They sent a man in a suit who smiled too much and talked about her legacy. Sarah looked up. What did she say? Violet's smile was sharp as broken glass. She told him some legacies aren't for sale, and he could take his offer straight to hell. Emma giggled despite the tension, then covered her mouth. Violet's expression softened when she looked at the girl. Your great-grandmother was meaner than a snake when she needed to be, but only when she needed to be. Jim shifted in his chair. Tell them about the boundary changes. Violet nodded and pulled out a surveyor's map marked with red ink. In 1990, Catherine got creative. She took 5 acres on the western slope and registered it under a defunct church trust, made it harder for anyone to trace full ownership. The mineral rights on that parcel are tangled in so much legal confusion that no company could touch them without years of court battles. She traced the boundary with one gnarled finger. She also filed complaints about every survey crew that came sniffing around, challenged property assessments, and tied up the county recorder's office with so many documents they stopped trying to keep up. Sarah felt something like awe mixing with the fear in her chest. She fought them alone. Violet's eyes grew distant. She was alone long before the fight started. Your mother saw to that. The words carried weight that pressed down on all of them. Sarah cleared her throat. What happens now? Violet's gaze snapped back to the present, sharp and focused. Now you decide if you're going to keep what she protected or pass it off to someone who'll tear it apart for profit. Before Sarah could answer, her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. We need to meet, others facing same pressure. Jim has details. Jim glanced at his phone and nodded. Ben Cooper. He's been organizing. There's a gathering tonight at my place. Violet stood, the conversation clearly over. Go, learn who your allies are. But remember, in fights like this, allies can become enemies fast when money gets loud enough. Jim's cabin sat on 10 acres bordering the national forest, a structure he'd built himself after returning from Vietnam. Inside was sparse but functional, everything arranged with military precision. 8 people had already gathered when Sarah, Emma, and Jim arrived. They sat in a rough circle on mismatched chairs, their faces carrying the particular exhaustion of those who'd been fighting longer than they wanted. Ben Cooper stood when they entered. He was 38, lean and weathered from years of working his orchard. His handshake was firm. Sarah Mitchell, heard you inherited the old place. He gestured to the others. This is Maggie and Frank Porter. They farm the land that borders yours on the north side. Maggie was in her 60s with kind eyes that had seen too much worry. Frank sat beside her, one hand resting protectively on her knee. His knuckles were swollen with arthritis. Ben continued around the circle, introducing families who owned small parcels scattered across the valley. All of them had received offers. All of them had refused. All of them looked scared. Ben pulled out a folder and spread documents across Jim's coffee table. I dated the county clerk's niece last year. Didn't end well, but I kept some copies of things I probably shouldn't have seen. He tapped a memo stamped with the county seal. There's a rezoning vote scheduled for the end of the month. Northern Ridge Redevelopment Overlay. They don't name your property specifically, but the boundaries match perfectly. Sarah leaned forward, studying the legal language. What does it mean? Jim answered, his voice flat. It means they're creating a legal pathway to force you out, even if you won't sell. Mixed industrial use gives them authority to claim eminent domain for economic development. Maggie's voice trembled when she spoke. We got 3 offers this year, each one higher. The last one came with a warning. Frank lifted his shirt sleeve, revealing a bruise the size of a fist on his upper arm, purple and yellow with age. Someone ran me off the road 2 weeks ago. Didn't say anything. Just looked at me while I was in the ditch and drove away. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. Did you report it? Frank's laugh was bitter. To who? Sheriff Reed's a good man, but he's one person against a system that's already decided which side it's on. Ben pulled out another document, this one a permit application. It gets worse. Pinnacle Resource Group applied for exploratory drilling permits on the Porterland's eastern boundary, the parcel that was sold 5 years ago. Jim took the paper and studied it, his expression darkening. Directional drilling. They're going to drill from land they already own toward mineral deposits under your properties. Sarah's stomach turned. Can they do that? Jim's eyes carried the weight of knowledge earned in coal country. It's called the rule of capture. If they can reach minerals from their land, even if the deposits extend under yours, they can legally extract them. By the time you fight it in court, the minerals are already gone. Silence settled heavy in the room. Sarah looked at each face in turn. These were people who'd held their ground for years, watching their options narrow while corporations circled like vultures. What do we do? Jim stood and moved to a large map he'd pinned to the wall. Red markers indicated property boundaries. Blue showed access roads. Green marked water sources. We fight on multiple fronts, legal, public, and physical if necessary. He pointed to the courthouse downtown. Sarah, you need to attend that council meeting. Spoke publicly. Make them acknowledge you exist. He turned to Ben. You monitor the council, feed information to any press that'll listen. Make this story bigger than one property dispute. His finger moved to Frank and Maggie. You two organize the other landowners. Strengthen numbers. They can't intimidate all of us at once. Frank's voice was quiet but steady. What about you? Jim's smile carried ghosts from jungles on the other side of the world. I'll handle security. Make sure we know when they're coming and have proof of what they do. Over the next 3 days, Jim installed trail cameras at 6 points around Sarah's property, motion sensors on access roads. He taught her how to document everything, how to preserve the chain of evidence, how to think like someone who expected to be betrayed. Sarah drove into town on the 4th day, leaving Emma with Violet. The sheriff's office sat between the post office and a thrift shop still advertising Christmas decorations in mid-November. Sheriff Thomas Reed looked up when she entered, his expression unreadable, but not hostile. He was 45, with the build of someone who'd stayed fit through discipline rather than vanity. Ms. Mitchell, I wondered when you'd come by. Sarah sat in the chair across from his desk without being invited. I need to know if the law protects people like me or just people with money. Reed's jaw tightened slightly. The law protects everyone equally. Sarah pulled out the council meeting notice Ben had given her. Then explain this. Reed studied the document, his eyes moving across the text with the practiced smarta of someone who'd read too many legal papers. It's a rezoning proposal. Happens all the time. Sarah leaned forward. It targets my land specifically. You know it. I know it. Everyone in this town knows it. Reed set the paper down carefully. I can't stop a legal vote even if I disagree with it. His eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw the conflict there. But I can tell you that 3 council members have financial ties to subsidiaries of Pinnacle Resource Group. I can give you copies of those connections. What you do with them is your choice. He pulled a folder from his desk drawer and pushed it across. I also want you to know that Catherine Mitchell paid my mother's medical bills when I was 16. Anonymously. I found out later, after Catherine was gone. His voice roughened slightly. I owed her a debt I never got to repay. Maybe I can repay it to you instead. Sarah took the folder, her hands shaking slightly. Why are you telling me this? Reed's expression hardened. Because I watched this valley get stripped and sold piece by piece my whole life. Watched good people lose everything while companies made billions. I'm tired of watching. He stood, signaling the conversation was over. But Sarah, you need to understand something. I can give you information. I can look the other way sometimes. But when they come with court orders and legal authority, I'll have to enforce the law. His eyes held hers. The law isn't always on the right side. Sarah left the sheriff's office with the folder clutched against her chest. A black SUV was parked across the street, engine running. The driver watched her through tinted windows. She got in her truck and drove home, checking her rearview mirror every 30 seconds. The SUV followed at a distance, not hiding its presence. That night, Jim stayed in the barn. Sarah heard him moving around outside, checking the cameras, testing the sensors. She lay awake listening to the house settle and creak, wondering how long they could hold out against pressure that was just beginning to build. The knock came at 2 in the afternoon, professional and precise. Sarah had been expecting it, but that didn't make her hands shake any less when she opened the door. David Klein stood on her porch in a wool coat that cost more than her truck. His shoes were polished despite the mud. His smile suggested practiced sympathy. Ms. Mitchell, I'm David Klein with Pinnacle Resource Group. Do you have a moment? Sarah's throat felt tight, but she kept her voice level. I'm not selling. Klein's smile didn't falter. I appreciate directness, but I'd like to have a conversation about options that might benefit both of us. He gestured toward the porch chairs. May I? Sarah stepped aside but didn't invite him in. They sat in the cold, the space between them filled with everything unsaid. Klein pulled out a leather portfolio. I'll be frank with you. This property sits on top of mineral deposits that are essential for renewable energy technology. Batteries for electric vehicles, wind turbines, solar panels. The future of clean energy depends on resources like what's beneath your feet. He opened the portfolio, showing her photographs of smiling workers and gleaming factories. Pinnacle can extract these minerals responsibly while providing jobs for this community. We're talking about revitalizing an entire region. Sarah watched his face, noting the careful control of every expression. How much? Klein didn't hesitate. 7 figures, possibly more depending on geological assessments. The number hit her like cold water. 7 figures. Enough money to give Emma everything she'd never had. Education, security, a future that didn't involve choosing between food and heat. Klein watched her process the offer, his eyes reading her face like data. Think about your daughter. Stability, safety. This property requires constant maintenance that you can't afford. Old wells fail. Structures collapse. He paused, letting the implications settle. Accidents happen. Sarah's hands clenched in her lap, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. Is that a threat? Klein's expression shifted to manufactured offense. Of course not. I'm simply pointing out the practical challenges of maintaining a property this size, especially for someone in your financial situation. He handed her a business card, thick stock, with no website listed. Take some time. Think about it. But you should know that this opportunity won't remain open indefinitely. He stood, brushing invisible dust from his coat. I'll be in touch. Sarah watched him walk to his SUV, every movement calculated. When he drove away, she realized she'd been holding her breath. Jim appeared from around the corner of the house. I recorded everything. He held up his phone, the screen showing Klein's face in clear detail. We've got him on record making threats, however subtle. Sarah's legs felt weak. She sat down hard on the porch step. He offered 7 figures. Jim sat beside her. Catherine was offered more. She still said no. Sarah turned to look at him. Catherine wasn't homeless 6 months ago. Catherine didn't have a daughter to protect. Jim's voice was gentle but firm. Catherine had a granddaughter she never got to know because she chose this land over compromise. You think that didn't cost her everything? The words sat between them like stones. That night, Jim installed additional cameras and taught Sarah how to check her truck for tampering, how to vary her routes, how to recognize surveillance. In Vietnam, we learned that the enemy you see isn't the dangerous one. It's the one watching from the shadows that kills you. 3 days later, Emma got sick. Sarah woke to the sound of retching from the bathroom. Emma was pale, sweat beading on her forehead, her small body shaking. Mom, I don't feel good. Sarah carried her back to bed, fear clawing at her chest. She ran to the kitchen and turned on the tap. The water that came out was cloudy, carrying a chemical smell that made her stomach turn. She grabbed a tea and filled it, then called Jim. He arrived within minutes and took one look at the water. Don't drink this. Don't even touch it. They drove to the county health department. Emma wrapped in blankets in the back seat. The wait for results felt like drowning in slow motion. 4 hours later, the technician emerged with a grim expression. Diesel fuel contamination. Someone poured accelerant into your well intake. Sarah's world tilted. Someone poisoned my daughter. The technician's face was sympathetic, but helpless. I'm required to report this to the sheriff. But Ms. Mitchell, without witnesses or physical evidence linking a specific person, the sentence trailed off, unfinished but clear. Sheriff Reed arrived at the farmhouse an hour later. He searched the area around the well, finding a diesel container hidden in the brush. Wiped clean of fingerprints. Professional. He pulled footage from Jim's trail cameras. A vehicle had approached at 3 in the morning, headlights off. The license plate was obscured. Reed's hands clenched into fists as he watched the playback. This is attempted murder, but without proof of who. Jim's voice cut through. We know who? Klein as good as threatened her 3 days ago. Reed's eyes were hard when he looked at them. Knowing isn't proving, and Klein's smart enough to have hired someone else to do this. Emma recovered slowly, the mild poisoning scary but not severe. But something had changed in her eyes. She was quieter now, harder somehow. 10 years old and already learning that safety was a lie. Sarah made a decision that night. We're going public. All of it. Jim started to object, but she cut him off. They want us scared and silent, so we do the opposite. We make so much noise they can't make us disappear. She spent the next 12 hours writing the history of the land, Catherine's 70-year resistance, the mining company's escalating pressure, the water poisoning. All of it laid out in clear, uncompromising language. Ben helped her place it. Regional newspapers, environmental blogs, local television stations. The article went live at 6 in the morning. By noon, Sarah's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters wanted interviews. Environmental groups wanted to help. Angry council members wanted her to retract lies. Anonymous voices wanted her to know that accidents could get worse. The town split cleanly down the middle. Some saw her as a hero protecting heritage. Others saw her as an outsider blocking progress and jobs. Sarah walked into the diner that afternoon and felt the room divide. Half the people nodded in support. The other half turned their backs. Violet appeared and sat beside her. Good. Let them choose sides. Better to know where people stand before the real fight starts. 3 days after the article, Ben called with news that made Sarah's blood run cold. They moved a drilling rig onto the old Porter parcel. Full production equipment. They're not waiting for permits anymore. Sarah, Jim, and Ben drove to the site. The rig stood like a steel insect, its arm already angled toward the earth. Jim studied the setup with professional eyes. Directional drilling. They'll be under your property within 10 days. Sarah's hands shook. Can't we stop them legally? Ben pulled out his phone, showing her filing dates and permit applications. Rebecca Chen, that environmental law student from the university, is working on an injunction. But it takes time. Jim's voice was flat. We don't have time. That night, they gathered at Jim's cabin again. 15 people now, the coalition growing as word spread. Jim laid out a map on the table. If they can't access the drilling site, they can't drill. We need to block the access road. Frank's voice was uncertain. Block it how? Jim's eyes carried determination forged in fire. With our bodies if necessary. Non-violent, but absolute. Maggie's face went pale. They'll arrest us. Jim nodded. Maybe, but every arrest is publicity. Every confrontation is documented. We make them choose between backing down and becoming the villains in front of cameras. Sarah looked around the room at faces weathered by sun and worry, at hands calloused from work that measured worth in harvests and seasons. How many of you are willing to stand with me? Every hand went up, even Maggie's, though it trembled. They planned through the night, shifts and supplies, who would bring food and water, how to rotate people without leaving gaps. Jim explained the principles of nonviolent resistance, drawing on training and history and hard-won experience. As dawn approached, Maggie pulled Sarah aside. There's something you should know. Her voice was barely a whisper. Frank and I got another offer last week, double what they offered before. Sarah's chest tightened. What did you tell them? Maggie's eyes filled with tears. We said no, but they showed us pictures of our grandchildren at school, playing in their yard. Her voice broke. They said accidents happen to families that make wrong choices. Sarah pulled her into a hug, feeling the older woman shake against her. We'll protect each other. But even as she said it, she wondered if that promise was one she could keep. The blockade began at dawn on a Thursday. 20 people gathered at the access road to the drilling site, parking vehicles across the gravel path and forming a human chain across the remaining space. Jim had organized it with military precision. 3-hour shifts, cameras recording everything, media contacts notified. By mid-morning, the first news van had arrived. By noon, there were 5. Sarah stood in the center of the line, Jim on one side and Ben on the other. Emma was with Violette, protected and far from whatever violence might come. The drilling company's response came at 2 in the afternoon. 6 private security contractors arrived in unmarked trucks. They were large men with military bearings, hired muscle trained to intimidate without crossing clear legal lines. Their supervisor approached the blockade. "You're trespassing on private property. Leave now or face arrest." Jim's voice was calm. "Show us the mineral rights documentation proving you can drill beneath adjacent properties." The supervisor's face hardened. "That's proprietary information." Jim didn't move. "Then you have no legal standing to drill." The contractor radioed to someone, waited, received instructions. Then he signaled to his men. They moved forward, hands reaching for protesters. Jim stepped forward, his bearing shifting into something that made even the contractors pause. "Son, I'm a veteran. These are property owners. Touch anyone here and you'll regret it." The moment stretched, tension pulling tight as wire. Then Sheriff Reed's cruiser appeared over the rise, lights flashing. Reed stepped out, surveying the scene with careful eyes. His face showed nothing, but Sarah saw the conflict there, the calculation of duty versus debt. The supervisor turned to him. "Sheriff, these people are trespassing. Remove them." Reed's voice was measured. "Show me your permits and mineral rights documentation first." The supervisor's jaw clenched. "We have surface rights to this property." Reed's eyes were hard. "I asked for subsurface mineral rights documentation. Until I see proof you can legally drill beneath adjacent properties, I can't verify this operation is lawful." The supervisor pulled out his phone, voice rising. "I'll have your badge for this." Reed's stance didn't shift. "Maybe, but today I'm upholding the law as I understand it." The contractors withdrew, engines rumbling as they drove away. But the threat in their retreat was clear. As the sun set, Sarah remained at the blockade with a core group of 10. They built a fire in a barrel, huddled close for warmth. Jim brought coffee at midnight. "This is just the beginning. They'll regroup, come back with different tactics." Sarah stared into the flames. "How long can we hold?" Jim's voice carried weight earned across decades. "As long as we have to. That's how you win wars you can't afford to lose." In the distance, headlights appeared. A black SUV moving slowly along the ridge. Watching, waiting. The phone call came at 7 in the morning, Frank Porter's voice cracking before he could finish the first sentence. "We signed the papers yesterday. We're moving out in 48 hours. Sarah stood in the kitchen, the receiver pressed against her ear, her world narrowing to those words and their implications. "Frank, what happened?" The silence on the other end stretched long enough that she thought he'd hung up. Then Maggie's voice came through, raw with tears. "They sent us photographs. Our grandbabies at school, at the playground, getting off the bus." Her breath hitched. "They said gas leaks happen, brake lines fail. We couldn't risk them." Sarah's grip on the phone tightened until her knuckles went white. "Where are you going?" Frank's voice returned, hollow. "Tennessee. Maggie's sister has a place. We'll be gone by Friday." The call ended. Sarah stood holding dead air, feeling the coalition crack beneath the weight of terror that had finally found its mark. Jim appeared in the doorway, reading her expression. "Porter sold." It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded, throat too tight for words. Jim crossed to the window, looking out at the ridge. "Can't blame them. Fear for your children breaks people faster than anything else." He turned back, his face carrying the weight of too many battles. "This is what corporations do. They find what you love most and threaten it until you break." Sarah's hands shook. "What does it mean for us?" Jim pulled out his phone, showing her a property map with the Porter parcel highlighted. "It means Pinnacle now owns land that borders yours on 2 sides. Legal drilling access established." He zoomed in on survey markers. "They'll move equipment in within days. Once they start extracting, fighting it becomes fighting over something already gone." That afternoon, Ben called with confirmation. Drilling equipment was being transported toward the Porter land. Full production rigs, not exploratory. They weren't waiting anymore. Sarah drove to the Porter farmhouse that evening. The moving truck sat in the driveway, already half loaded. Maggie stood on the porch, her face aged a decade in a week. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Sarah climbed the steps and pulled her into an embrace. You protected your family. I understand. Frank emerged from inside carrying a box of kitchen items. His eyes couldn't meet Sarah's. We're cowards. Sarah's voice was firm. You're human. There's no shame in choosing your grandchildren over land. Frank set down the box and pulled an envelope from his pocket. We kept one parcel, 2 acres between our old property and yours. Couldn't bring ourselves to give them everything. He handed her the deed. It's yours now. Won't stop them, but maybe it slows them down. Sarah took the envelope, feeling the weight of the gesture. This is more than you had to do. Maggie wiped her eyes. Catherine would have fought to the end. We don't have that kind of strength. Sarah looked at both of them, seeing the guilt and relief warring in their expressions. Catherine fought alone for 70 years. Maybe that's the part we're supposed to change. 3 days after the porters left, Jim's trail cameras captured the first equipment arriving. 2 drilling rigs, support vehicles, a crew of 15 men working in shifts. They weren't hiding anymore. Sarah stood at her kitchen window watching the distant activity, feeling the ground shift beneath everything she'd built. Emma came downstairs, dressed for school but moving slowly. Are they going to take our house? Sarah's heart cracked at the question. They're going to treat. Emma sat at the table, her small hands flat on the wood. Great-Grandma Catherine didn't let them. Why would we? The simple logic of a 10-year-old cutting through complexity to reach the core truth. Some things were worth fighting for even when the odds made fighting seem pointless. Sarah knelt beside her daughter. We won't, but it's going to get harder before it gets better. Emma's eyes were older than they should be. I know. That night, the coalition met again at Jim's cabin, 15 people now, with the porters gone. The room felt smaller, the odds longer. Ben spread new documents across the table. Pinnacle filed updated permits this morning. Directional drilling authorized from the Porter parcel toward mapped mineral deposits. He circled coordinates on the map. They'll be under your property within 8 days. Rebecca Chen appeared via video call on Ben's laptop, her law school textbooks visible behind her. I'm filing an emergency injunction petition tomorrow, but we need to prove environmental harm or illegal activity. Without that, the judge won't stop legal drilling on land they own. Jim's finger traced the drilling angle on the map. What if the drilling isn't legal? Rebecca leaned closer to her camera. Explain. Jim pulled up geological surveys on his phone. Catherine documented water table depths across this entire valley. The aquifer that feeds Sarah's well connects directly to the drilling site. He showed Rebecca the measurements. Any contamination from their operation flows straight into her water supply. That's not incidental damage. That's negligent endangerment. Rebecca's eyes widened. That could work. Can you testify as an expert witness? Jim's smile was grim. I've testified in mining cases before. Companies hate when engineers speak in court. The plan formed through the night. Rebecca would file for an emergency hearing. Jim would provide expert testimony. Sarah would document every impact on her property. But legal battles took time. Time they didn't have. Ben voiced what everyone was thinking. Even if we win in court, they might extract the minerals before the ruling comes through. Sarah stood, decision crystallizing. Then we go back to the blockade. But bigger this time, we make it impossible for them to work without national media watching. Jim's expression shifted into something tactical. We'll need more people, and we'll need to be ready for them to escalate. Over the next 2 days, word spread. More landowners joined. Environmental activists from Charleston drove in. Students from the university organized carpools. By Thursday morning, 40 people gathered at the access road to the drilling site. Sarah stood at the center, cameras recording, reporters asking questions. She'd written a statement, practiced it until the words felt like armor. We're here because some things matter more than profit. This land has supported families for over a century. The water that flows through these mountains doesn't belong to corporations. It belongs to everyone who drinks it. Her voice carried across the crowd. We won't be moved. We won't be silenced. And we won't let fear win. The applause was drowned out by the rumble of approaching engines. 6 drilling company trucks arrived, followed by 12 security contractors. Behind them, a white van marked Legal Observer suggested the company had prepared for confrontation. The head contractor stepped forward, a man in his 50s with the bearing of former military. You have 1 hour to disperse. After that, we'll remove you by force. Jim moved to stand beside Sarah, his presence steady. Show us documentation proving mineral rights beneath adjacent properties. The contractor's jaw tightened. We have legal authority to operate on land we own. Jim's voice remained level. Operating on your land is legal. Extracting minerals from beneath someone else's property requires subsurface rights documentation. Show me the permits. The contractor pulled out his radio. We've got a situation. Request supervisor on site. 20 minutes later, a black SUV arrived. David Klein stepped out wearing a different coat, but the same calculated expression. His eyes swept the crowd, cataloging faces and cameras. He walked directly to Sarah, ignoring Jim. Ms. Mitchell, this has gone far enough. Sarah's heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. Show me your mineral rights permits, and we'll leave. Klein's smile was sharp. You're making this personal when it should be business. Sarah stepped closer, aware of cameras recording every word. You poisoned my daughter's water supply. It was always personal. Klein's expression flickered, something dark moving beneath the professional veneer. I have no knowledge of any water contamination. Jim's voice cut in. Your company has been pressuring landowners for months. We have documentation. Klein turned to face him. Offering to purchase property isn't illegal, Mr. Warren. His eyes moved back to Sarah. Neither is warning someone about the very real dangers of maintaining an old, deteriorating farmhouse. Wells fail. Structures collapse. These are facts, not threats. Sheriff Reed's cruiser appeared at the edge of the gathering, engine idling. He stepped out slowly, assessing the standoff with careful eyes. Klein gestured toward him. Sheriff, these people are blocking lawful business operations. Reed's voice was measured. I need to see permits authorizing subsurface mineral extraction beneath Mitchell property. Klein's professional mask slipped slightly. That's proprietary information. Reed's expression hardened. Then I can't verify the legality of your drilling operation. Klein's hands clenched. This is obstruction. I'll have your badge and pension for this. Reed's stance didn't shift. Maybe, but until you produce documentation, I'm treating this as a civil dispute, not criminal trespass. The contractors moved closer, forming a line opposite the protesters. The space between the two groups compressed, tension building like pressure before a storm. Emma appeared at the edge of the crowd with Violet, despite Sarah's explicit instructions to stay away. Sarah's breath caught. She started toward her daughter, but Klein's voice stopped her. Quite a crowd you've assembled, Ms. Mitchell, including children, irresponsible, bringing a child to a potential conflict zone. His words were calculated, designed to wound. Sarah turned back, something fierce rising in her chest. You sent men to photograph other people's grandchildren at school. Don't lecture me about putting children at risk. Klein's eyes widened fractionally. The cameras caught it. That's slander. Ben stepped forward, holding up his phone. The porters have sworn statements, photographs of the photographs, everything documented. Klein's professional control fractured. Color rose in his face. You're nobody. A homeless woman playing property owner. This land will be ours one way or another. His voice rose, legal or otherwise. The words hung in the air like smoke. Every camera had caught them. Every reporter's recorder had captured the threat. Sheriff Reed stepped between Klein and Sarah. Mr. Klein, that sounded like a criminal threat. Klein realized his mistake, his face going pale. I was speaking metaphorically about legal processes. Reed held up a hand. Save it for your lawyers. Right now, I'm advising you to leave before this situation escalates further. Klein's jaw worked, fury and calculation warring in his expression. Finally, he turned and stalked back to his SUV. Before getting in, he looked at Sarah one last time. This isn't over. The engine roared to life and the vehicle disappeared down the access road. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Sarah felt no victory. Klein's threat would spread across social media within hours. Pinnacle's lawyers would claim it was taken out of context. The battle had just entered a new phase. Reed approached her, his voice low. That recording won't stop them, but it might slow them down. Sarah nodded, exhaustion creeping in. How long? Reed's eyes held truth he didn't want to speak. Days, maybe a week. Then they'll come back with better lawyers and court orders I won't be able to ignore. That night, Rebecca called with news. The emergency injunction hearing was scheduled for Monday morning. Federal court, Judge Elizabeth Moreno presiding. She has a background in environmental law. That's good for us. Rebecca's voice carried cautious hope. But Pinnacle's bringing a team of 5 lawyers. This will be brutal. Sarah spent the weekend preparing. Jim helped organize evidence. Ben compiled media coverage. Emma drew a timeline chart on poster board, connecting events with careful lines. Sunday evening, Sarah sat at the kitchen table surrounded by papers, trying to distill 70 years of resistance into testimony that would matter. Jim brought coffee and sat across from her. You're going to do fine. Sarah's hands shook slightly. What if it's not enough? Jim's eyes held steady. Then we keep fighting. That's what soldiers do. We fight until we can't, and then we find a way to fight some more. Emma appeared in the doorway, already dressed for bed. Mom, I want to come to court. Sarah started to object, but Emma's expression stopped her. Great-Grandma Catherine protected this for me. I should be there. The simple logic cut through every protective instinct Sarah had. Okay, but you stay quiet unless the judge asks you a question. Emma nodded solemnly. Monday morning arrived cold and clear. The federal courthouse in Charleston was 3 hours away. They left before dawn, Jim driving while Sarah reviewed notes in the passenger seat. The courtroom was already packed when they arrived. Media in the back rows, environmental groups on one side, Pinnacle executives and their legal team on the other. Judge Moreno entered precisely at 9, her gray hair pulled back, her eyes sharp behind frameless glasses. This is an emergency petition for injunctive relief. Let's proceed efficiently. Pinnacle's lead attorney stood, a man in his 60s with the smooth confidence of someone who'd won more cases than he'd lost. Your Honor, the petitioner is attempting to halt lawful business operations through spurious environmental claims. Pinnacle Resource Group owns the property in question and has secured all necessary permits. He placed documents before the judge. The minerals in question lie beneath land we legally purchased. Ms. Mitchell's objections are based on speculation, not science. Rebecca stood, her youth apparent, next to Pinnacle's legal team, but her voice steady. Your Honor, the petition isn't about stopping legal operations. It's about preventing environmental damage to adjacent properties and shared water resources. She presented Jim's geological surveys. Expert analysis shows the aquifer serving Ms. Mitchell's property connects directly to the drilling site. Any contamination will flow into her well. That's not speculation, that's hydrology. Judge Moreno studied the documents, her expression unreadable. I'll hear testimony. Ms. Mitchell, you're first. Sarah stood, her legs unsteady. She walked to the witness stand and was sworn in. Rebecca began gently. Tell the court about your inheritance. Sarah's voice started quiet but grew stronger as she spoke. She explained the farmhouse, Catherine's 70-year resistance, the hidden documents revealing mineral deposits. My grandmother protected this land because she understood what extraction would cost, not in dollars but in water and soil and futures. Rebecca showed the judge photographs of the water contamination incident. 2 weeks after you returned, your daughter became ill. What happened? Sarah's voice tightened. Someone poured diesel fuel into our well. Emma was sick for 3 days. Pinnacle's lawyer objected. There's no proof connecting my client to that incident. Judge Moreno's eyes were cold. Noted. Continue. Rebecca presented the timeline of offers and pressure, building toward Klein's recorded threat. Your Honor, I'd like to play audio from the protest 2 days ago. The recording played in the silent courtroom. Klein's voice clear and unmistakable. This land will be ours, legal or otherwise. Judge Moreno's expression didn't change, but her pen moved across her notepad. Pinnacle's attorney stood for cross-examination. Ms. Mitchell, you've been homeless for 6 months prior to this inheritance, correct? Sarah's jaw tightened. Yes. The attorney's voice dripped with false sympathy. And this property represents significant financial value. Wouldn't selling provide security for your daughter? Sarah met his eyes. What if it poisons the water for every family downstream? The attorney smiled. Very noble. But you're not a geologist or environmental scientist, are you? Sarah's voice remained steady. No, but I know what it means when someone threatens your child. The attorney switched tactics. You've accused my client of harassment and intimidation. Can you prove Pinnacle was behind the well contamination? Sarah's hands clenched. I know diesel fuel doesn't appear in wells naturally. The attorney pressed. But you have no evidence connecting Pinnacle to that act, correct? Rebecca stood. Objection. Argumentative. Judge Moreno sustained it. Jim was called next. He walked to the stand with military bearing, his credentials read into the record. Mining engineer. 40 years of experience. Expert witness in 6 previous cases. Rebecca led him through the geological analysis, mineral deposits, and water table connections. In your professional opinion, would drilling at the proposed site contaminate Ms. Mitchell's water supply? Jim's voice was firm. Not would, will. The aquifer is a connected system. Any chemical contamination from drilling operations will flow directly into wells drawing from the same source. He pulled out diagrams explaining water flow and pressure gradients with the precision of someone who'd spent decades reading stone. Pinnacle's attorney approached for cross-examination. Mr. Warren, you're not currently employed as an engineer, are you? Jim's eyes didn't waver. I'm retired. The attorney's tone turned dismissive. And your last employment was in the 1990s? Jim nodded. My last corporate employment. I've consulted independently since then. The attorney shuffled papers. You also served in Vietnam. Honorable service, I'm sure. But PTSD can affect judgment and perception. Rebecca shot to her feet. Objection, relevance, and prejudice. Judge Moreno's voice was sharp. Sustained. Counsel, stick to facts relevant to this case. The attorney switched approaches. Mr. Warren, isn't it true that modern drilling techniques have improved significantly since your active years? Jim's voice carried weight earned in coal country. Techniques improve. Physics doesn't change. Water flows downhill. Chemicals seep through porous rock. Those are constants no amount of technology alters. Judge Moreno leaned forward. In your expert opinion, what is the risk level of contamination? Jim met her eyes. Not risk, Your Honor. Certainty. The only variable is how long it takes. The courtroom went silent. Judge Moreno looked at Emma sitting in the gallery. Young lady, is that your daughter? Sarah nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Emma Mitchell. Judge Moreno's voice softened slightly. Emma, why does this matter to you? Emma stood, her voice clear despite her size. Because my great-grandmother trusted me to protect it. I can't let her down. The simple statement landed like thunder. Judge Moreno removed her glasses, studying the girl. Thank you. You may sit. Rebecca presented final evidence. Trail camera footage. Financial records showing council member conflicts of interest. Sheriff Reed's sworn statement witnessing intimidation. Your Honor, this isn't just about one property. It's about whether corporations can use legal maneuvering and intimidation to override community rights. Pinnacle's attorney made his closing argument, emphasizing legal property rights and economic development. Judge Moreno called a 30-minute recess. The wait felt like drowning. When she returned, her expression gave nothing away. This court has reviewed all evidence and testimony. While Pinnacle Resource Group legally owns the surface rights to the Porter property, subsurface mineral rights documentation remains insufficient regarding extraction beneath adjacent parcels. Sarah's heart hammered. Furthermore, expert testimony establishes a clear and present danger of environmental contamination affecting shared water resources. The potential harm is not speculative, but scientifically demonstrated. Judge Moreno's voice grew firmer. Therefore, this court grants a temporary restraining order. All drilling operations are to cease immediately pending comprehensive environmental review. She looked directly at Pinnacle's legal team. Additionally, recorded threats and evidence of potential criminal activity are being referred to the State Attorney General's office for investigation. The gavel came down. Sarah felt her legs give out. Rebecca caught her arm, steadying her. The gallery erupted in applause before the bailiff called for order. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Sarah made a brief statement, keeping it simple. Today, the court chose people over profit. That's what justice looks like. David Klein emerged from a side entrance surrounded by lawyers. Cameras caught his expression of barely controlled fury. Jim drove them home in silence, letting the victory settle without words. That night, the farmhouse filled with people. Ben brought food, Violet brought wine. Other families from the coalition stopped by to share the moment. But Sarah found herself on the porch alone, staring at the ridge. Jim joined her, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "You won." Sarah took the coffee, warmth seeping into her frozen hands. "For now, they'll appeal." Jim's voice was quiet. "They will, but you bought time, and you proved something." Sarah looked at him. "What?" Jim's eyes held the weight of too many battles. That fighting back is possible. That ordinary people can stand against corporations and win. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. "Job offer still open if you're interested. Education coordinator position. Charleston, starts next month." She stared at the screen, the message glowing in the dark. Jim noticed her expression. "What is it?" Sarah's throat tightened. "Job offer, Charleston, good salary, benefits, everything Emma needs." Jim's voice was careful. "When did it come?" Sarah's hands shook. 2 weeks ago, before the blockade, before everything. The weight of the choice pressed down on her. Take the job, sell the land to a conservation group, move on. Give Emma stability and safety and a future that didn't involve constant fighting. Or stay. Keep fighting. Accept that this battle might never truly end. Jim's voice was gentle. "Catherine once told me something. Being brave isn't about never being afraid. It's about knowing what's worth being afraid for." He paused. "What are you afraid of?" Sarah's tears came suddenly, surprising her. "Failing Emma, failing Catherine, failing myself." Jim's hand rested on her shoulder. "You already passed the only test that matters. You showed up." Emma appeared in the doorway wrapped in a quilt. "Mom, I heard about Charleston." Sarah's heart cracked. You need school and friends and a normal life." Emma cut her off. "I need to know you don't quit. That's what I need." Her voice was fierce. "Great-Grandma Catherine didn't quit for 70 years. We can't quit after 70 days. Sarah pulled her daughter close, feeling the determination in that small frame. The next morning, she called the Charleston office and declined the position. The voice on the other end was disappointed but understanding. "If you change your mind, let us know." Sarah hung up and felt the bridge burn behind her. 2 days later, representatives from the Appalachian Land Conservancy arrived. Carol Henley was a tall woman in her 60s with surveyor's eyes. Malcolm was younger, carrying a laptop and cautious optimism. They sat at Sarah's kitchen table, reviewing documents. Conservation easement protects the land permanently. You retain ownership, but development rights are restricted in perpetuity. Carol's voice was firm but kind. Minerals stay in the ground. Surface remains intact. Community access maintained. Malcolm pulled up legal documents. "The requirement is an on-site steward, someone committed to living here, maintaining the property, ensuring compliance." He looked at Sarah. "That would be you." Sarah read through the terms. Permanent residency requirement, no easy exit, no freedom to leave when things got hard. Jim reviewed the legal language, his engineering mind parsing every clause. "This locks you in, but it also locks them out forever." Sarah thought about Charleston, about city sidewalks and regular paychecks and lives that didn't require constant vigilance. Then she thought about Catherine, alone in this house for 70 years, choosing difficulty over compromise. "What else can I add to the agreement?" Carol raised an eyebrow. "What do you want?" Sarah's voice grew steady. "Community Education Center. Local hiring priority for any programs, historical preservation of the farmhouse structure, and if minerals are ever extracted under extreme necessity, percentage goes to Environmental Restoration Fund." Carol smiled. "We can work with that." The signing took place a week later. Small gathering, Jim, Violet, Sheriff Reed, Ben, Rebecca, and families from the coalition. Catherine's locket hung around Sarah's neck as she signed her name on documents that would bind her to this land for life. Emma held the original 1882 deed, the paper yellow and fragile, but still declaring Mitchell ownership. When the final signature was placed, Carol stood. "This land is now protected in perpetuity. What your great-great-grandfather found, what Catherine defended, what you fought for, it endures." The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders. heavier than anything she'd carried before, but also lighter somehow, because choosing what you'll fight for makes the fight itself bearable. 1 year later, autumn painted the ridge in colors that suggested fire without heat. Sarah stood on the newly repaired porch, watching Emma lead a tour group of middle school students toward the spring house. The farmhouse had been restored carefully. Fresh paint over old wood, new porch boards cut to match the originals. Everything preserved rather than replaced. The barn had been converted to an education center. Geological exhibits, Catherine's journals in glass cases, maps showing the valley's history from 1882 to present. Jim's cabin now sat officially on the property, built with Sarah's permission. He taught survival skills on weekends and ran veteran support groups on Wednesdays. Sheriff Reed had resigned his position 6 months ago, unable to reconcile legal obligations with moral convictions. He worked as a private investigator now, specializing in environmental cases. The Porter land had been purchased by a conservation trust after Pinnacle sold it at a loss. The drilling scars were healing slowly, serving as education exhibits about extraction's costs. Violet visited every Tuesday, helping run programs and telling Catherine's stories to groups who gathered to hear about resistance that spanned generations. Ben's Orchard thrived now, free from development threats, supplying restaurants throughout the region. Pinnacle's investigation continued. David Klein had been transferred to a different region. The company's Appalachian operations had scaled back significantly, reputation damaged by publicity Sarah's fight had generated. But in other valleys, other battles continued, other families facing the same pressure. Sarah's phone rang. Unknown number. Ms. Mitchell? My name is Jessica Torres. I inherited my grandmother's land in eastern Kentucky. Mining company's been pressuring me for months. The young woman's voice shook. I heard what you did. Can you help me? Sarah looked at Jim splitting wood near the barn, at Emma explaining geological formations to attentive students, at mountains standing witness to struggles that never truly ended. Come to the farmhouse tomorrow. We'll talk about what protecting land really means. Jessica's relief came through clearly. Thank you. I didn't know who else to call. Sarah thought about bus stations at 2 a.m, about inheritance that looked like burden until you understood it was trust. You called the right place. That evening, after the students had left and Emma had finished her homework, Sarah sat at the kitchen table. 3 women gathered around maps and documents. Emma pointed to survey markers. This is where great-great-grandfather found the first deposits. Jessica leaned closer, taking notes. Sarah spread Catherine's tactical playbook across the table. Your grandmother left you more than land. She left you a blueprint for resistance. Lamplight cast warm shadows across papers that told stories of families who'd chosen difficulty over surrender. Outside, Jim checked the trail cameras one more time before heading to his cabin. Violet's car pulled away, headlights sweeping across the clearing. The mountains stood silent, holding their centuries of secrets. Sarah looked at Jessica, seeing her own fear reflected back. Fighting alone is how you lose. That's the first thing you need to understand, Emma added softly. Great-Grandma Catherine fought alone for 70 years. We're changing that part. Sarah's voice carried certainty earned in court battles and blockades, in poisoned wells, and public confrontations. Catherine didn't leave me this land to save it once. She left it so someone would keep saving it. Every day, every generation. She met Jessica's eyes. That's the real inheritance. The mountains gave no answer, but in their silence lived a promise that some things endure because people choose to make them last. Sarah touched Catherine's locket, feeling the weight of legacy that measured worth in seasons rather than dollars. Tomorrow they would teach Jessica how to read survey maps and file injunctions, how to build coalitions and face down corporations. Tonight the farmhouse stood warm against the November cold, lights glowing in windows that had witnessed generations of Mitchell women learning the same lesson. Some things aren't meant to be owned, but they're always meant to be protected. And the work of protection never ends. It just finds new hands willing to carry it forward.